So thanks for joining us today. I'm Scott Allard, Associate Professor here at the School of Social Service Administration and an affiliate of the Population Research Center. It's a really, I think, an exciting day for SSA, for the Pop Center, and for the university, as both Gene and Tom indicated. We're really excited to have just a wonderfully diverse group of community actors, community organizations, scholars, and folks from the city here who are all committed to strengthening our communities. I'd like to reiterate some of the thanks for this conference. Actually, I'd like to thank Chad Broughton and Tony Radin, who helped brainstorm this idea with me. And so the credit should be shared with lots of people, and them in particular. I also want to thank the staff and the volunteers who've really helped make this happen. Wonderful staff here at SSA and the Pop Center staff who've helped us coordinate this. And I really like to thank Maureen Stimming, who you'll see kind of bouncing around. She's been great to work with, and I want to give her a particular thanks. We have a little bit of a tight timeline today, so we're going to try to stay on schedule. The speakers are aware of this. The morning speakers will each have about 20 minutes, and that'll give us some time for Q&A. And we'll have people with microphones roaming the tight spaces between you for questions. If you have a question that doesn't get answered, there'll be evaluation forms that we'll hand out. Actually, I think they're in your packets, actually. And I'd really encourage you to put down, in addition to your comments on the conference, to put down questions that you might not have had a chance to ask. And we'll try to the best we can, post stuff online, and we'll be distributing an email with a web link, and we'll try to continue to follow up with resources and materials after this. I'm really pleased to have organized this conference at SSA because I think it connects to our highest values as a school and as a university. And I think these are values that drew me to SSA as I pursued my own research on issues of place, poverty, and the safety net. And one such value, prominent value, is that of promoting social justice. We might think of the census as a data product, right? A survey, if you will. But the census is about people and neighborhoods. It affects the availability of programs and services for our parents, for our grandparents, for our children, for our neighbors. It helps us understand the accessibility of job opportunities and changes in the labor market. It helps us identify patterns of inequality and, importantly, helps us think about policies that will reduce inequality. It defines the resources available for our communities, and it shapes political representation and our voice as citizens. And another core value I think that we'll speak to today and connect to today is one about strengthening community. And today's conference will discuss the role and engage community-based organizations and what they do to ensure a successful census and a complete count, and what that count will mean for building strong and well-connected communities. This conference also reflects SSA and its partners' commitment to high-quality research. Our history as a school, and you see this in the banners here in our lobby, lie in the research of scholars who worked in communities and in settlement houses to better understand population dynamics in our cities' neighborhoods. These scholars challenged assumptions about society and sought new ways of understanding. And today, I hope you see new pathways for research, investigating some of the most pressing problems we face as a community and as a society, but also see the critical role that census data and other data play in that research. And then finally, and a little bit selfishly, it's a real treat for me to be here. I've only been here a couple years. And I feel like when I look out in the audience, I see a lot of new friends and a lot of new colleagues and collaborators. And I'm thrilled to be connected with you and the work you're doing. And so this has been a neat way for me to continue to build those relationships and to continue to translate what I do to the community and make a difference. And with that, thank you to you all for coming. I'll turn it over to Alan and Bob. Alan Berube is a senior fellow and research director at the Metropolitan Policy Program of the Brookings Institution. He manages the program's research agenda, significant, large research agenda, actually. They do a lot of really great work, including the forthcoming volume, State of Metropolitan America, which chronicles a decade of demographic and social change in our nation's cities and suburbs. And then to his left, Bob Garriga is a research fellow at Chapin Hall here at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on improving the available information on children and families, particularly those who require specialized services related to abuse and neglect, disability, poverty, or mental illness. And he is also the co-founder of the International Society for Child Indicators. Please join me in welcoming Alan to the podium.
Thank you very much. Somebody going to fire this up for me? Excellent. I'll just vamp until we get there. So I too want to thank the university. I want to thank SSA. I especially want to thank Scott here, quite literally, the poster boy for the School of Social Service Administration, for inviting me to the Chicago 2010 Census Conference. And at the risk of annoying or offending all of them, today I'm not going to talk about the 2010 census very much, nor am I going to talk about Chicago very much. I don't think I was really asked to talk about Chicago. I think Bob will do a little bit more of that. But as Scott alluded to, I'm going to preview for you a forthcoming major report from the shop where I work at Brookings, and the title of the report is The State of Metropolitan America. But even though I'm not going to talk about the 2010 census, I mean, implicit in what I'm going to do here is relevance for conducting a full and accurate count, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So, State of Metropolitan America, what is it? Actually, internally at least, for shorthand purposes, we call this project SOMA, State of Metropolitan America, which I always like because Soma is Greek for body, right? And it's body and it's people, and it makes sense. And then somebody reminded me the other week that Soma was also the name of the drug in Brave New World, and they thought that didn't sell very well, and so I'm trying to avoid calling it that. But why are we doing it? I think many of you may remember that at least in the late 1990s, HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, published an annual State of the Cities report, sort of chronicling how cities were doing, and it was an administration document, so it was also trying to sell the administration's policies, but I think it played a valuable role in chronicling the state of our urban areas across the United States, and in fact a lot of other countries around the world do this now because the United States did, and they do it on an annual or biannual basis, but we don't do it anymore. We stopped doing it after the Bush administration took office, and I guess HUD's got its hands full right now with a major housing crisis in America, so they haven't gotten around to it quite yet again, but we're going to step into the breach and try to play that role. So in May, we're going to put out a major report on demographic, social, and economic change in the 2000s in metropolitan America. And our major, in fact, primary data source for this is the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. This is a rich, valuable source of annual information on dynamics, at least in larger American communities, especially the cities and metropolitan areas where we focus our time and attention. And as most of you know, the ACS replaced what used to be the long form on the decennial census, and as we'll hear more about today, there's really only a short form for 2010. Of course, doing a complete and accurate count in the 2010 census establishes the basis for an accurate sample design in the ACS and a lot of other census surveys. So how the 2010 census goes has big implications for how useful a tool the American Community Survey is. And this is a comprehensive report we're going to put out, and it's going to inaugurate an ongoing series of analyses at Brookings on some of the topics I'm going to talk about today. So the report's going to cover 9 major subject areas that represent really the main topics within the American Community Survey, the old long form, population, race and ethnicity, immigration, aging, et cetera, with the exception of housing, because I think if you're not reporting on what the housing market looked like last week, you're a little bit behind. So we left that out of this version. We might come back around to it when the housing market stabilizes a bit. And we're going to examine all these topics through the lens of the nation's largest metropolitan areas, especially its 100 largest metropolitan areas, those places with 500,000 people or more, and their constituent cities and suburbs. So let me just let me frame this by talking about the themes that we're seeing that cut across all of these subject areas. The first is what we argue is the increasingly metropolitan character of our population, and the fact that we think a lot of what large metropolitan areas are, who they are harbingers for the direction of our society to come and the challenges it's going to face. Secondly, increasing unevenness we're seeing across metropolitan areas, really for us rivaling some of the racial, ethnic, and economic disparities at the national level with which we're all familiar, but these really coming up from a regional basis and perhaps echoes of sort of earlier in the 20th century when regional disparities were a big deal. The United States made huge investments in the South to bring it up to the national average. I think there are suggestions that there's a bit of pulling apart going on again. And third, trends within metropolitan areas in cities and suburbs that I think upend traditional notions of community types in America, who lives in different types of communities, what those communities need. So in each of these three themes, I'm going to step through a few illustrative findings. So just first, in defense, if you can see this line here, in defense of our focus on the 100 largest metropolitan areas, we see that these places represent an increasing share of our nation's population over time, from 44% at the turn of the 20th century to about 65, 66% today. This is not just due to the growth and expansion of metropolitan boundaries and their redefinition. This actually projects the 2008 definition of metropolitan areas backward. So you're looking at the same geographies in 1900 that you are in 2008, and you see this reflection of migration to and greater population growth within these 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. While they represent 2/3 of our nation's population, sit on only about 1/8 of our land area, they contain even larger shares of the racial and ethnic minority populations that in about 30 years are going to collectively constitute a majority of our U.S. population. And so in that sense, big metro areas reflect the more diverse society we are becoming and are ahead of the curve in that sense. This brings, I think, great opportunity, but terrific challenges as well. On educational attainment, you can see that large metro areas and their residents are more highly educated than the rest of the nation, 31% possessing a bachelor's degree versus 21% elsewhere. And no surprise, they're home to some of the highest value economic activity in the United States as a consequence of that. But they also exemplify the very deep racial and ethnic divisions on educational attainment that I think if they continue to go unaddressed could further widen economic divisions, slow national economic growth, and lower our standards of living as those groups, especially Latinos and African Americans, become an increasing share of U.S. population. You can see Latinos earn four-year college degrees at less than half the rate as non-Hispanic whites do in these largest metro areas. Large metro areas also exhibiting the growing polarization of income across the United States. So if you define middle class as any household that makes from 20% below to 50% above their metropolitan area's median income, the numbers of middle class households, the share of all households that they represent, continue to dwindle during this decade as you see growth at the upper and lower ends of the spectrum. So all of these trends, these four trends I just highlighted, reflect large metropolitan areas and where they are in the aggregate. But when you peel back the cover, you actually reveal widening differences in and among metropolitan areas themselves. This begins with their size and importance, not nationally, but within their states as well. Most states have a majority, at least 50% of their populations living in these large metropolitan areas. But that goes anywhere from 0% in a few of those little states at the top of the map there, Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming, that have no population whatsoever in large metropolitan areas, to less than half in some states in the Southeast and the Plains, to more than 80% in the highly urbanized portions of the Northeast, the state of Florida, and parts of the West, all of which suggest that we're a more metropolitan nation, but we are urbanizing across the country at quite different rates. The 2000s themselves brought a great unevenness during the decade in metropolitan population trends. The first few years, and that's exemplified by the table on the left-hand side, accelerated the long-standing shift of population to Sunbelt destinations, especially in the interior West, Florida, and portions of the Southeast. So these were the metropolitan areas with the greatest net in-migration in the 2003 to 2004 period. Project forward just 4 years after the housing bubble popped, and you see, first of all, just dramatic slowing in migration in all metropolitan areas, where the top area, Phoenix, gained 50,000 people versus the top area, Riverside, gaining 95,000 people just 4 years before, and practical reversal of migration in many of these destinations. The state of Florida, in the aggregate, experiencing what looks like the first instance of net outmigration, net domestic outmigration in the state's history, and the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino, California, going from the number one the number one place on the migration list in 2003, 2004 to 350th out of 363 metropolitan areas in 2007, 2008. A really dramatic reversal in a very short period of time and great unevenness underlying that. Migration patterns, native achievement trends as well are further widening differences in educational attainment among metropolitan areas. These are the 5 metropolitan areas among the top 100 with the highest rates of bachelor's degree attainment and the 5 lowest. And you see that there are more than 3 times as many adults as a share of population holding college degrees and the highest educated metropolitan area, Washington, D.C., as in the lowest, which is Bakersfield, California, way over there on the right. And in addition to there being tremendous disparities in 2008, the trend is actually reifying these differences. So the metropolitan areas near the top of the list making much larger gains in their highly educated population during the decade than those at the bottom. So in a sense, the smart metropolitan areas are getting smarter faster than everybody else. The differences in economic outcomes at the metropolitan level even more stark during the 2000s because everybody made some progress on educational attainment. No metropolitan area saw a declining share of its adults with bachelor's degrees. But this was not the case on median incomes. You saw very large declines in household incomes, 10% or more really, clustered in this Great Lakes region, portions of the southeastern United States. At the same time, you saw gains concentrating, clustering along the northeast corridor there and in portions of California as well. The onset of the deeper recession in 2009, again, these data just go through 2008, may yet wipe out some of those gains, but I think have the likely consequence of accelerating the losses that are going on in these Great Lakes metropolitan areas due to especially to the decline of the auto industry and further widening these disparities in outcomes that we saw through most of the decade. Metropolitan areas also highly uneven on characteristics like commuting. So the options and the choices, other than getting yourself to work by driving alone, are themselves highly concentrated. There were only 19 among the top 100 metropolitan areas that see more than a quarter of their workers do something other than driving alone to work. And for me, this is easy to forget as I groan each morning when I get on the red line in D.C., but at least I'm not in Oklahoma City where if you want to take the bus, you got to flag it down like this, and when it comes along every 40 minutes or so. So, the difference between the top and the bottom here and the relative concentration of those options in a small number of metropolitan areas, I think have the potential to set up a very uneven playing field for metropolitan areas as we move towards a further carbon-constrained environment and economy. Now, even as that playing field among metropolitan areas becomes more uneven, there's greater complexity within metropolitan areas that I think may be narrowing some of the historical disparities that we're all quite familiar with. It's hard to know whether what's going on in the last couple of years is a temporary blip or more of a lasting phenomenon, but one byproduct of the housing market crash has been a steep slowdown in migration to the outer parts of metropolitan areas, to outer suburbs and exurbs, which are exemplified by the green and the yellow lines on the map here, where urban areas and inner suburban areas are the orange line towards the bottom. So in a sense, cities and inner suburbs have been the beneficiaries by holding on to more would-be migrants. And in fact, when you look at individual cities like New York, LA County, San Francisco, and even Cook County here in Illinois, these places have all halved the amount of out-migration in the last couple of years that they were experiencing only 3 or 4 years before during the heady days of the housing boom. Older cities as well in particular seem to have during this decade experienced a bit of a repopularization among white population. In several, and I've just highlighted a few here, Atlanta, Boston, New York, St. Louis, and Washington, the steep declines in white population they experienced in the 1990s have essentially reversed, sometimes by large margins, Washington and Atlanta being being two of the poster children for this trend. None, of course, have become majority white cities. They're still majority non-white cities. But there is, in fact, sort of a demographic inversion going on in a small but perhaps growing number of metropolitan areas, even as a majority of all racial and ethnic groups today now live in suburbs. And it's not just racial and ethnic diversity pervading suburbs. There's diversity in household types that's going on as well. The iconic mid-20th century suburban household, a married family with children, accounts for just 1 in 4 suburban households today across the largest metropolitan areas. And for the first time, single-person households have actually surpassed married couples with children in suburbia. This reflects a number of things. It reflects the different choices that coming-of-age households, young households are making about where they want to locate. But even more than that, I think reflects the continued and the growing aging in place of a senior population that that itself grew up in the suburbs and will continue to live there as they get older. And there's economic diversity going on in suburbia, too. The 2000s, as we pointed out in some recent research, were also a tipping point for poverty in metropolitan America. Now that a majority of poor people in major metropolitan areas live in suburbs. And their numbers, you can see the orange line here, their number is growing much faster than the number of poor in cities, about 5 times the rate of city poverty in the 2000s. And in fact, spreading far beyond the older suburbs, the suburbs that are often associated with the characteristics of urban distress, poor populations now going well into the mature mid-century suburbs, even outer suburbs and exurbs in some metropolitan areas. And I think the economic decline of Midwestern metropolitan areas, immigration to booming suburbs in the Southeast, and the aging of housing in suburbs everywhere all contribute to this phenomenon that we're seeing. So let me try to bring this together pretty quickly here. What do these 3 themes, the more metropolitan nation, the less perfect union, and this more complex metropolitan society, indicate about where we are and where we're headed? We're trying to think about this in sort of 3 different ways, about markets, about policy, and politics as well. And these are just suggestions. We're still working on these and welcome folks' feedback. On markets, I think this pulling apart of metropolitan areas, widening disparities on education and income and commuting, increasingly are creating very disparate starting positions for our major metropolitan economies in a very competitive global economy. And in fact, the recession seems to be accentuating these differences, particularly in these Sunbelt destinations that could be overbuilt for years because of this sudden migration reversal. And I think we're still, from a market perspective, coming to grips with the need to change our housing and our built environment to accommodate new household types in suburbia, especially the aging boomer generation. On policy, the continued growth of non-white minorities and the stark disparities in educational attainment among those populations, I think more and more make boosting educational attainment a prerequisite for economic growth. I think this administration in Washington realizes this, but there is a long road ahead on that challenge and many decades of policy and investment that need to follow. The suburbanization of poverty, the suburbanization of seniors, a lot of the stuff that Scott's work, I think, demonstrates quite well, forces us to radically rethink how we deliver services to a needy population that's really everywhere within metropolitan areas now, and to ensure their civic engagement as well. On politics, I think we're seeing through these data some of the demographic underpinnings of the increasingly polarized electorate with which we're all quite familiar these days. And folks like Bill Bishop have written books called The Great Sort, and essentially we're seeing this sorting of the American population across and among these metropolitan areas in new and quite disparate ways. Major metropolitan areas like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle are sort of gateways to the world and gateways for trade. For instance, need serious infrastructure investments to keep our nation competitive, but as they become more different from everywhere else, they become more successful. I think the consensus for those investments could grow more fragile. In an increasing number of our metropolitan areas, the uneven age-race profile of the population, where you've got a younger minority population and an older white population, if that becomes oppositional, that could create real challenges for securing what are really needed investments in our younger people. And finally, the blurring of urban and suburban lines, more hopefully, I think, creates the basis for more shared problem solving on what truly are more regional issues than ever, on things like housing and transportation, economic and workforce development. So I focused here on the report that we're going to put out in a couple of months, but this is part of a larger suite of material that's going to accompany and follow that rollout in May. And a particular note, I just want to tell people that we're going to unveil a new web tool that really puts the state of Metro America on the map and allows users to visualize data on metropolitan areas, cities, and suburbs for 200, 300, 400, depending how you count, different indicators from across the American Community Survey, which I hope will help people to spot trends, identify their peers, and really understand their communities better. And this, in turn, is going to inaugurate an ongoing series of publications at Brookings that are going to examine these and other topics in depth, including a report on what we're going to learn from Census 2010. This is where to find us. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the discussion.
I also want to thank Scott for organizing this conference that's of importance to everyone. I also want to thank Dean Marsh. I'm an alum, and it's fun coming back to SSA. When I put together this presentation, this is the first time I called something this, the demography of vulnerable children and families in Chicago. As you see, I'm trying to capture population changes, a little bit about the supply and demand for services in Chicago, and also kind of the utilization of services across many different domains in Chicago. So if anybody has any better suggestions for a title for what I'm going to talk about, I'd appreciate it, but this is, I think, the best I could come up with. Got it. So this is a little overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Talk about the goals of this work, and the goals of this work is very much at the local level. So it's very different from what Alan spoke of, and it's very different from even looking at county level. We're going to look at Chicago and within Chicago. So there's special challenges to doing that. Look at some of the trends in the population for young children and some of the methods we use to come up with that information. As I mentioned, we're going to look at the supply and demand for early childhood education and human services in Chicago, a little bit also on out of school time services programs. Recently, we've done work on multi-system families, so families that show up in multiple services or programs of the state, and then talk a little bit at the end about future challenges. I want to acknowledge support that I've received from both the city and the state. It's not just financial support, it's moral support and data support, perhaps most importantly. I want to thank Commissioner Karen and Tony Radin, who has been very helpful in this work. We've been doing work with the city department for about 7 years now, and focusing very much on Head Start community assessment and out-of-school time programs. Recently, we're working with the past two governors' offices, and they've been very supportive and actually asked us to do a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today. And also great support from Jerry Sturmer, who many of you know from the governor's office right now. Also great support from Director McEwen from the Department of Children and Family Services. We also had good working relationships with Department of Human Services, DJJ, DFS, and corrections at the state level. So the goals of this work, I just want to repeat it, is really to better inform agency leaders and policymakers on the characteristics and the needs of children and families for the purposes of planning and resource allocation, needs assessment, program development, and evaluation. Again, it's very much, I can't stress enough that we're really trying to get at a very fine-grained analysis here, very much at the local level, the best we can. Because as a society, we have a very poor understanding, I think, of the needs of all children, a poor understanding of the most vulnerable children, and and even lack of understanding of the most isolated families. While the universities and universities across the country do a lot of work on these topics, there's very little at the local level, and even less that's timely, that tells us really what's happening now. And the issues of the recession and kind of knowing what's happening to families as a result of recession is a good example of that. So the lack of information is due in part to a lack of timely data. And there have been great improvements by the Census Bureau in providing timely data. I think the ACS is a great tool for doing that. However, it doesn't provide us with local level data, with census tract level or Chicago community level data. So in that way, it's limited. We also haven't extracted data much from government information systems. It'll come as a surprise to many of you for me saying that, but there's much more that we could do with that data, and there's a number of challenges around doing that. Surveys, there have been a number of great surveys done in Chicago over the past decade, large surveys, large expensive surveys, but they're quickly out of date to speak to some of the important issues that policymakers and service providers have. We don't analyze the data that we have very much, and need to have more resources to do that. So why are these challenges happening? Certainly privacy and confidentiality is a very big issue. Data providers, including the Census Bureau, spend a lot of time on this issue, and it's important. It's critically important to protect identities and to be vigilant about the use of the data. But it's often also used as an excuse as to restrict access by government agencies. So in order to address these concerns, I think we have to develop better relationships with government agencies, have them trust, as a group of researchers, develop relationships so they trust you, so you know you won't stab them in the back with data that you get from them. Also, tight data security is important. We all know issues of identity theft, and it's more important to be very careful about how we maintain the data. There are certainly political and bureaucratic obstacles to using, to addressing the challenges I mentioned before. So we spent a lot of time developing data sharing agreements that protects everybody's interests. And there are few incentives for academic researchers to address these problems. But we really need to when you need data at the local level. There's such fantastic national data available now on a variety of topics. These are rich data sources that many of my colleagues here use and should be used, but they don't provide the type of local data that we need that I'll talk about in a few minutes, that I'll show in a few minutes. So the Chicago community areas in Chicago are critical for service providers, for people trying to do things in Chicago. And they originated here in the 1920s, created by the Social Science Research Committee here at the university. There are 77 of them. They correspond to groups of census tracts. So that works out nicely when we have good census tract data. They don't perfectly correspond to the current names that many people use for these neighborhoods. We're here at the border of Hyde Park and Woodlawn, and that works great. But when you get on some of the near north side and near north side areas, it doesn't work so well. And again, the School of Chicago School of Sociology here at the university show that how different groups of people move through these communities. So it's difficult to be responsive to what's happening given changes in the composition and development in these communities. So that's really the context for the research that we're going to do, is really look at what's happening in the Chicago community areas. There's one more point here. The Chicago community areas aren't a census designation. So it makes it a little difficult through the ACS to get updated information on a yearly basis. I did communicate with the Census Bureau about this a year ago, and they told me that these areas are ineligible for designation as census designated places, quote unquote. So I know there's been some work to deal with that, and potentially there's some new information on that I'm not aware of, but it is a problem in the city when data isn't provided at the Chicago community area level. So the data sources we use in our population projections, which I'm going to get to in just a minute, are the Census Bureau data, the 1990 and 2000 census data. The 1990-2008 Cook County population estimates done by the Bureau. The Bureau also does poverty estimates for the Chicago Public Schools, which are extremely valuable. And then we add a lot of administrative data. We look at the Chicago Public Schools enrollment data, we look at the unemployment data, and we look at aggregate food stamp population data to better understand the trends in the number of poor families, the number of kids. So we combine census data with administrative data that's available from the schools, from the state, and from the Department of Human Services in Illinois. I want to acknowledge John Diltz and Ducky Yang and their help on this work. These maps are hard to see on your printout and also a little hard to see on the overhead. So this report, which is called Chicago Children and Youth 1990-2010, is available on our website, and I'll give the website address at the end of the talk, and I think it's also on your printout. But you can get this off our website and have nice pictures of the maps. So this is a map of the growth patterns in the population of children 0 to 17 from 1990 to 2005 that we used our projections and estimates for. You can see that. Well, maybe you can't see, but I'll say that in Grand Boulevard. If you see the light yellow areas in here, you see these communities losing about 6% of their population every year from 1990 to 2005. There are also communities that, the dark blue communities here, West Lawn as an example, Archer Heights, that are growing at an average of 6% every year. There's also a set of communities that are light blue that have gained 10% every year from 1990 to 1995, and then have dropped since 1995, 3% every year. And then the other areas have grown about 2% every year, but most of the communities, the yellow communities, have stayed very stable over this period of time. So there's areas of the city that are growing tremendously, some shrinking, but most of the communities in the city are very stable. I just want to mention when I say growth, I don't necessarily mean mobility. The growth is a combination of changes in the size of families as well as mobility. When you look at this map, we talk about changes in the population of children under 6. The dark blue areas are areas which have grown tremendously over the past, during this decade. The lighter areas have actually shrunk. Most of the communities have, in terms of young children, have grown slightly, while there's been a similar decrease as for the 0 to 17-year-olds. But there's a slightly different dynamic with kids under 6. When we talk about changes in number of children, we also talk about the changes in poverty. This map shows that even though as population has moved to the northwest, southwest, and southeast sides of the city, we've also seen increases in poverty in those communities. So there's been a dispersion of poor families across the city, as well as families becoming more poor in some of those communities. It's important, as I talk about changes in poverty, to say that there are still communities that have lost a lot of their poor children, that still have a lot of poor children. Just close to us here in Englewood and West Englewood, there's been tremendous drops in the number of children in those communities, but they're still some of the largest communities in Chicago in terms of poor children. So as we think about changes in the number of poor children in these communities, we also have to keep in mind that there still are many children in those communities that require support. So many of you are ahead of me saying, oh, that has to do with Latino families or Hispanic children in these communities changing, and it is the case. So of the 29 communities that have large growth over the past 15 years, 27 have had increases in their Hispanic population. Those community areas with the largest overall growth have seen the largest growth in the Hispanic population. And if we project that right about now, that Hispanic 0 to 17-year-olds will be the largest group in the city, surpassing African American children. And when we have data for 2009 and 2010, I think we'll be able to see that. We go through a couple of maps that, again, are a little bit hard to see. This is the Hispanic population, and we can see the same areas that grew with the 0 to 17-year-old population are also areas where the Hispanic population grew for that age group. They're growing in the, again, northwest, southwest, southeast sides of the city and shrinking primarily along the north side lakefront and in some areas on the southeast side. I want to shift now to talking a little bit more about the supply and demand for services. This looks at out-of-time school slots for 13 to 17-year-olds in Chicago. And with all this change in the size of the population, the size of the child population in these communities, in some cases the services haven't been able to maintain their supply in those communities. So the dark blue areas here show where there's relatively small number of services per child. And while the lighter areas, light yellow areas show there's a larger number. So as the population changes, all the services that we expect to see for children, schools, childcare, out-of-school time programs, need to move to where those children are. And there's a biggest lag for schools, but there's also a lag for these other programs. This shows the same type of thing for childcare slots. It's slightly different, but the overall story is the same. And this next map shows what the issue is for Head Start for 3 to 4-year-olds in Chicago. Chicago is somewhat amazing in that the early childhood program providers have gotten together and actually put pre-K slots where there aren't Head Start slots and moved around slots so that Head Start slots can be where the poor population actually is. Many of you know about combined funding across these funding streams in early childhood programs, and it's actually worked very well in Chicago. The city has done a good job, and the city and schools have done a good job in providing slots in those areas where eligible kids live. I'm going to move now to our work on multi-systems families. I want to acknowledge Cheryl Smithgall, Rupa Shashradri, and Pete Ballard with their help on this work. The governor's office asked us to look at multi-system families. They were concerned that a small number of families were using a disproportionate share of the state resources, and that if we had a better understanding of that group of families, we could not only perhaps serve them more efficiently, but more effectively and address some of the concerns. So what we did was, using state administrative data, we looked at families from the Department of Human Services and the Department of Children and Family Services in 2007 and 2008. We linked data across a number of different agencies, including, as you see, mental health services claimed through Medicaid, substance abuse treatment, also through Medicaid, adult incarceration, juvenile incarceration, and foster care. This is a description of our study population. Again, we combined families from DCFS and DHS, primarily in the TANF and food stamps program, to look at, to try to come up with the best compilation of family members according to where they were living and who they had lived with over time. So it's very much a longitudinal study. Our findings were we found 23% of our study population were multi-system families. We studied 500,000 families, and 23% of them, a little over 100,000 families, were multi-system families. Those 500,000 families pretty much correspond to all low-income. It's very similar to the number of low-income families under 200% of the poverty line in Chicago. They accounted for 63% of the problems that we identified. So those 5 problems, mental health services, substance abuse treatment, juvenile incarceration, adult incarceration, and foster care, they accounted for about 86% of the dollars in these programs. And we accounted for dollars over a 15-year period, and it was about $60 billion that we accounted for that went to our study population, and 86% of those dollars went to the 23% that we found to be multi-service families. So 1 in 15 households with children in Illinois are a multi-system family. And another thing that was interesting is that most of these families received mental health services. Whether or not they were effective is an important question that we can't really answer, but they did receive mental health services, which was surprising to us. So this is the key figure that shows much of what I just said, that 23% of our study population accounted for 63% of the problems, accounted for 86% of the dollars. This is a depiction of the data we combined from Human Services, Medicaid, Child and Family Services, and Corrections to create our data set. I'm getting the bum's rush here, so that's why I'm going a little bit faster. This is looking at this at the Chicago community area, looking at the percent of children, all children, who live in a multi-system family. And if you look at the dark blue areas, those are over 50% of the children in those communities live in multi-system families. So we combined our population projections with our calculation of multi-system families, and we came up with these percentages. Now, this is the Chicago community area look at things, and you see that some of the most vulnerable communities that many of you know about are as depicted here. We also did it at the census tract level, which gives a very different picture. The darker blue areas here are over 60% of the children in these census tracts. So while looking at the Chicago community area level is good, looking at the census tract is better and really allows us to pinpoint where we might bring services to bear on some of these issues. I'm going as fast as I can. I'll be done in a second. So in the future, we're really looking forward to the census tract level data from the ACS and the 2010 decennial data to allow us to see how well we did with our projections, and it will allow us, again, as Alan said, to have a point in time where we will be able to build our projections off. We still think we're going to have to do our projections because we won't be able to get at the level that we want in a timely way to understand what's happening to children. I think combining administrative data with survey data to extend the value of survey data is important. Mike Davern, who's in the room, and we have done a lot of work at the Census Bureau to link administrative data and the American Community Survey data and other data sets. That's an important and hopefully fruitful endeavor that more can do in the future. And most importantly, I think we want to explore the meaning of these data for better interventions and policies. This is really the goal of the work, to help all of you who are doing a lot of this work on a daily basis better understand what kind of services the multi-system families need, what kind of services can be focused on small regions within Chicago and within other metropolitan areas. Thanks.
So we have a few minutes for questions for Alan and Bob about their presentation. Some interesting trend data both nationally and locally. Yeah. We got a microphone. Perfect.
Okay. I'm questioning your information on the data set that you're using.
Is it on?
He has a question about the time series that we're using. So in our population work, we do projections on a yearly basis of the number of children at the census tract level and build that up to Chicago community area. And for our other data, we have data going back on some of these programs 5 or 6 years, so we can look at changes in the supply and demand of services at the small area level. And in our multi-systems families work, we've gone back about 15 years to include data on children and families and what services they've used across those 5 programs that I mentioned.
Yeah, so my question is when you're using, so this is a panel data set, is that correct? Longitudinal data set?
It's longitudinal, yes.
Okay, so are you checking for, say for example, unit roots in the panel data system to determine whether, you have, what should I say, problems with the statistical aspects of the data? Because if that's the case, your projection model may not be correct when you look at it in those terms.
Well, actually, our projection model is described in the document that I showed earlier. You can look at that. We've tested our projections with some of the most eminent demographers in the country, so we're pretty sure we're doing it the right way. But I don't exactly understand your question, but I can talk about it more. It's described in these reports.
Okay, and the other question was, is it seems that the data that you're presenting seems to be the results of the data, not the drivers of what is causing those changes in the demographics.
To a certain degree, yes, but I think the longitudinal nature allows us to look at some of the precursors to some of the things we see over time. So, thanks.
Hello?
Oh, I guess we have a question over here, and then we'll
I'm sorry. Joyce Gallagher, Department of Family and Support Services, Senior Services. And I was wondering, there's a huge grandparent raising grandchildren population, 100,000 children in the city of Chicago, probably a quarter of the public school system. And grandparents tend not to self-identify because they don't see themselves necessarily as being the caregivers in that context. They still hold out for their own children, taking that role. Have you accounted for that in your calculations? Because they really have a huge need, and I don't know if they're taking advantage of the services.
We included all members of all ages in our households as best we could. If they participate in a program in food stamps and they're part of the household and they're part of that food stamp program, we include them. So we have a good range so we have 3 generations in many of the households that we look at. But I agree, it's an important issue and something that the data doesn't do a great job, the data we have doesn't do a great job of looking at, which is another important reason why the Census Bureau data is so important, because it does get at grandparents taking care of grandchildren, and that is a growing area. We actually have some work we've done on that. You can look at our website also that looks at that.
Hello. I had a question for Alan about we have this concept of metropolitan areas as, you know, people living in a physical place and working of local economies, but with global economies, with distance commuting, with is that how are we able to capture that, or how is that trend evolving and emerging about what, you know, like our sense of community isn't what people who physically live next to us, and our sense of a metropolitan area. So for example, I think it affects places like this, but also like in some smaller communities, for example, that I know that, large, significant number of people with higher incomes are actually working in places that are physically distant. So how is that being captured in the sort of the state of metropolitan?
Mm-hmm. The Twitter effect and the Argonaut economy of people who live in here and work in San Jose or something like that. I mean, I certainly there's more of that going on today than there was 20 years ago, and I think the online world has changed people's notions of community and expanded them well beyond the conventional sort of Chicago school kind of neighborhood notion of what a community is. That said, I don't think the notion of the metropolitan area as the locus of economic activity and the interchange among physical communities within metropolitan areas for that economic activity has changed at all. I think the fact that an increasing share of U.S. population lives in these big metropolitan areas is a signal that there is something meaningful in a knowledge economy about being in a big place with a really thick labor market and a time when people, they don't have the same job for 25 years. They want to be in a place where there are many different job opportunities. That happens in big metropolitan areas. Spillover effects in a knowledge economy, people gaining knowledge not just from the people they work next to in the next cubicle, but clusters of related firms, people in related occupations. And the fact is that an increasing share of people who live in metropolitan areas work within that metropolitan area, but leave their community to get to wherever it is that they work. So, notwithstanding the argument that the world is flat and we're all going to go live on a mountaintop and telecommute somewhere, that's not the data. don't really show that. The trends don't really show that. I think this is a more metropolitan nation. All industrialized nations are more metropolitan nations today, and when we see that trend reverse, I'll be the first to admit it, but we haven't seen it yet.
David Martzell with the Center for Economic Progress. I wanted to ask a question maybe both for Alan and for Robert to connect some of what you brought up. As someone who's in the business of kind of designing, community-based economic security programs to help people deal with the crisis, I found it very interesting. I mean, we've got multiple data sets from the perspective of designing programs and interventions. You've got good data, administrative data from various state agencies, which hopefully will have funding to do the work that they need to do in the near future. Alan, you've worked with census data, you've also worked with tax data, but one of the things I find is that there are these disparate data sets and they sometimes don't connect very well to allow, whether it's, obviously census by census tract, IRS data, for example, which tracks incomes somewhat well by ZIP plus 4, administrative data, depending on the agency, how they do it. Do you see opportunities in the future to do a better job of connecting these types of data sets to design really smart programs that have a potential for significant community impact?
You should start.
Things are slowly getting better. I think what I mentioned, the work that Mike Daver and I have done around linking census data with administrative data sets, that work's very challenging because of some of the challenges I listed in my talk. But I think it is, the GIS systems allow us to do more powerful analyses at the local level. So I think the tools that are coming out to do that type of work, the data is available. According to your comment, having the money to do that, and state agencies do. With this budget crisis, they want more information. But to catch 22, they want more information now, and they don't have the money to really develop that information. So that's a big problem. But I think that we're poised to do a lot more with this data, and more importantly, as you suggest, use the data for local planning, program development, and evaluation.
And I think it's clear and understood that the more that poverty and other characteristics of need occur in new and different types of communities, the greater the need for those systems that bring those for systems that bring different data sources together that reflect the supply and the demand of this stuff. And we've seen signals in some of the data that we're looking at that the increases in unemployment have been at least as large, if not greater, in the outer suburbs of some metropolitan areas as in the cities. But the response on the uptake of food stamps is nowhere near what it is in the core urban areas and inner cities. So there's just the possibility of greater and greater participation mismatch if we don't bring these different systems together.
Yeah, actually, one of a project that Ben Roth and I, a doctoral student here at SA, are doing for Brookings is to look at the match of social service program resources in suburban areas to poverty, and it's difficult to bring services to bear in these communities that Bob points out where you have high need populations. We don't do a very good job of that, and we know a lot about those neighborhoods. And emerging poverty in suburbs, I think the gap is even larger, where we don't have the nonprofit capacity, the foundation investment, and certainly not the local investment. And the work we do, it's pretty striking when you go out into these places like Riverside, which isn't really a traditional suburb in some ways, but the need is great, and the capacity to serve is not as great. Thank you for the question. We have time for one more. Our distinguished colleague, Julie Henley, in the back.
This is for Bob. I was hoping you might help us interpret so 23% and 86% in the multifamily system data. Does that mean we're targeting well? How do we think about the fact that 86% of dollars are going to 23%?
Well, I don't think we're targeting well because we're not. Many times the agencies that are providing services for those families don't know that the other ones are providing services for those families. There's no suggestion that those monies go to those families are coordinated or integrated in any type of way. I would say in families that are in a child welfare system, those resources are coordinated better, where there's actually a strong case management function and an assessment function that happens in DCFS. But in other places, when you look at Medicaid, which is only really a financing mechanism, it's not a healthcare program. When you look at other programs, those dollars are going to these families and are a real opportunity in terms of being able to use them in a more flexible way. But I don't think we're not taking advantage of those now. So it's more of an issue that these are the families we need to target and perhaps try to integrate the services to those families in a better way, and to look at what families might be the next multi-system family, really to look at those families that are currently in the system perhaps in one program and try to prevent them from moving further and deeper into the system.
So join me in thanking our speakers